Team meeting, y'all. First swing of the day is going to be Ryan Fox. We're going to look at about 6 or 7 golf swings today. Can anybody tell me anything about Ryan Fox? What do you think you remember of his golf swing before we look at it? Hits it an absolute mile. Okay. Is that because of his club speed or because he's mega compressing the golf ball? Or a combination of the two? Combination of the two. Pretty fast, a lot of club speed, but also mega compression. What are some things we know about needing to create compression? You need what? Probably a lot of shaft lean. You need probably a strong club face to make it work with the amount of shaft lean you have. What can you tell me about Ryan Fox's setup position here? Top 3 strength of grips on the PGA Tour probably. Right? Him, Brendan Steele, probably top 2 strongest lead hand grips. Trail hand is certainly on the stronger side, right? You know, the generic way to analyze it is like looking at the line between the index finger and the thumb there. They call that the V shape. Whenever you see it pointing towards the back side of the body, so trail side, so that line goes to the right shoulder, it's pretty strong. Left hand going really out there. And here's something, when you're analyzing grips, okay, and if ever you're going to do like a lot of video analysis down the road, never look at the lines for just where they're pointing, and I'll tell you why. I can take a grip that is super strong, so lead hand very on top, trail hand really to the side. You see those 2 lines we were referencing, right? Well, if I keep them extremely on top, they're pointing where right now? To my trail side, right? To my right shoulder. What happens if I take this strength of grip and now I really change the way my setup position looks? Where are those lines pointing all of a sudden? They look neutral. Key is looking neutral, right? So what happens is the more I lean the shaft in my setup position, the more I'm going to take those lines that people will try to reference and I'm going to actually pull them towards my lead side, meaning it's an illusion, right? The grip is going to look a little bit less strong than it actually is. So in his case, now does he have a little bit of shaft lean in his setup? A little bit, right? Ball positions maybe on the back half, probably trying to flight this golf ball. But yet, despite the fact that he has a little bit of lean, the lines are still pointing to his trail side. So you can imagine that if he wasn't in this much lean to the shaft that's set up and his shaft was more straight up and down, where would those lines be pointing? Even more towards his trail side than usual. So it's actually an illusion. The more shaft lean you have, the less strong typically the grip is going to look from a front view perspective. So when you have a guy like this who has a little bit of lean to the shaft, now camera angle is not perfect. It's clearly like the camera's being filmed a little bit from in front of the tee box this way. It's also why the ball position maybe looks a little further back than it probably is in reality. But that grip be strong, right? So when you're going to have a grip that is this strong, what are you typically going to see with the club face angle? Generally, you will see it really strong throughout the backswing. Now, his club face is certainly looking on the stronger side, but does it look as shut as you would have expected given the strength of his grip? Probably not. So what is offsetting the club face not to look as strong despite how strong his grip is? A little bit of forearm rotation. What else? There's one key element here that stands out. Look at the wrist mechanics. As your grip gets stronger, where are you more likely to keep the wrist as you're hinging it up? More cupped, right? If I grip the club really, really strong, what am I even presetting with my wrist in my setup position? More cupped or more flexed? More cupped. As my grip gets really, really weak, and I'll exaggerate it for the visual, where am I more likely to preset my wrist at setup? More cupped or more flexed? More flexed, right? So the weaker the grip is, the more naturally you're going to want to see this wrist angle because that's how you're presetting it before you even start your golf swing. The stronger the grip gets, the more you're naturally going to see some cupping to it. If you took a grip that was as strong as his and his lead wrist wasn't there and it was flatter, where do you think the toe of that club would be pointing? Straight into the ground, right? So he has a really strong grip, but the reason he can make it work is because of 2 things. Knuckles are hinged above the forearm, which is a key that he's in some sort of cupping, right? The forearm is not following the wrist angle, which would imply that the wrist is flat. If the knuckles hinge above the forearm, it means there's some cupping to it. And you can see a little bit of a disconnect and a little bit of some forearm roll in the takeaway, right? He has a really, really strong grip, but he doesn't do this to it, because if his wrist was that flat and the arms were more connected and the forearms weren't rolling open, the face would be pointing way more close than it actually is. The only reason it points there is because he goes a little disconnected, a little bit of forearm rotation, and in this case, I'll go really strong grip, lead wrist, a little cup, something like this. And the face can look still on the stronger side, despite how cupped his wrist is, despite how much forearm roll he has, the face is still looking under control, which tells you how strong it is. So when you're going to see a guy who's going to grip it extremely strong, you have to understand, you have to make it work with everything else in the golf swing. You can get away with a grip being that strong, but you need a very specific combination of elements. He cannot afford to have the wrist be any flatter than where it is here. He just can't. His grip is too strong. Or else, keep in mind, let's say in theory, his wrist was flatter and the face was more closed. Is he guaranteed to hook it? Okay, so let's say he has the same strength grip, but instead of having the wrist angle as cupped as it is, it's on the flatter side. Obviously, the face would be even stronger, correct? It would be more shut. If the face was even more shut, is he guaranteed to hit a hook? No, definitely not, right? But how can he avoid hitting a hook? There's an inefficient way to do it and an efficient way to do it. The inefficient way would be backing out of it, adding loft, delivering a higher handle, things that open the face up. The more we raise this handle up, the more I point the face right, even if it's closed. Right? So I can take a face that's closed, tilt out of it, which points the face a little right, raise the handle up, and now my face isn't nearly as close anymore. So there is a way to band-aid it later in the golf swing if his face was stronger. What would be the efficient way of doing it without raising the handle and backing out of it? Right? The stronger the face is, the more lean I deliver. The more lean I deliver, the more I keep the face square. Now the problem is, if I have a face that is extremely closed and I deliver a crazy amount of shaft lean, you can probably get away with that on a wedge. There's a lot of loft. You'll still compress it and you'll just take some spin off and flight it. If you do that with a 4-iron, how's that ball going to launch in the air? Like negative degrees of launch almost. So there comes a point where even at a speed of this player, you can't have the club face be so crazy or you're going to get penalized somewhere in the bag. In his case, or in most cases, with too much shaft lean, long irons become a problem because you can't get them in the air. So we'll advance this a little bit now to the top of the backswing. What stands out here with the top of his backswing? The obvious that we saw in the takeaway. Wrist angle is in a significant amount of extension. Little what? Very little hand depth. Why does he have very little hand depth? Is he turning a significant amount into his hips? Subtle change in knee flex, which is good. So I don't necessarily mind the actual tilt of his pelvis, but doesn't have a lot of hip depth. If you don't have a lot of hip depth, your chest is not going to turn. It's hard to get the hands around your body. So you're naturally going to have a little bit less depth to the hands. I mean, his hands are maybe even in front of the toes of his feet. So he's got almost no hand depth at all. His lead arm is very upright, basically. Part of that is because of the lack of turn. Part of that also, what did we see with his takeaway? Where did his hands go in the takeaway? They went out and away from him. The further out and away from you go early, the harder it is to then wrap them into a deeper position later. If they're going out here, even if they try to get around you, there's not enough time. They're going to finish pretty upright at the top, right? So club face is in a good spot because his strength of grip offsets the wrist angles. So that's pretty good. But not the biggest hip turn, not the biggest amount of hand depth. How can he possibly keep this club shallow coming down from here? He either has to isolate the arms and independently shallow them out. So he's got to significantly change what his arm structure looks like to shallow it out. Or what is the more common way that golfers shallow it out when they don't have a lot of hand depth? How can I try to keep this thing to the inside? A lot of side bend. Is this not an extremely impressive position given where he was at the top of the backswing? Lead arm is way out in front of him because he had no hand depth, so naturally his hands are going to be a little bit more in this direction. It's unlikely they would have stayed on the deeper side, just given where they were at the top. Is his club face as shut as it was in the takeaway? Not even close. Do you think his club face would have ever been here given how strong it was at setup? So isn't it funny how you can get the right blend of pieces together, and even if you have the strongest grip you've ever seen, you can avoid the club face being super closed, right? So club face certainly neutralized to some degree. Lead wrist still in extension, but obviously the strength of grip works. How well is he turning his hips given where he was at the top? Pretty good, right? Everybody likes this position, but obviously, how did he get the hands and club to stay somewhat inside from up here? He's turning really well. Most golfers from that position at the top of the backswing, you would see the same side bending move, but very rarely would you see them still rotate as well as he is. It would typically come with a little bit more lateral and a little bit more stall and tilt, right? So by the time he actually gets to the ball, look at all of that side bend he's delivering. So his chest opened up to a certain extent, and then as soon as he gets anywhere near the bottom, it completely stalled out. And then the hands take over because left shoulder is clearly staying close here. It's not opening up anymore. You can see his shoulder plane looks very steep through the ball, which typically comes with a lot of side bend, right? The more I turn my chest, the more leveled out my shoulders are going to look through the ball. The more I side bend, the steeper and more vertical you're going to see my shoulder plane through the ball. So when he has so much side bend, he's basically offsetting the lack of hand depth and how strong his club face is. He needs to make it work that way. The face-on view is going to give you even more information. Look at the top of the backswing here. What could you tell me about the top of his backswing? There's not a lot of rotation, which is impressive because how far does he hit the golf ball? This is one of my favorite swings to show people because this, to me, is the perfect example of the unique blend of matchups you can create to hit successful golf shots. Anybody can look like your stereotypical, I turn, my arms are neutral, club is neutral, club shallows, and I turn, and it works really well. We know those philosophies. But when I have a pattern where the golfer has separation with the chest in the backswing, not a lot of turn, arms got very upright, an extremely strong grip, the face is still closed even though he's cupped, well, you think this is unique. Wait till you see the way he transitions into the ball. How's that for side bend? Right? The very definition of chest tilted back, bended to the right, and his hip pushing forward and his pressure moving forward. So his hips are going this way, and they're actually rotating really well given this pattern. I see this pattern all day in my online lessons. Very rarely is it accompanied by such good leg work and rotation. He hits very compressed. First of all, most golfers wouldn't hit it very high with his pattern. He tends to hit it higher because he has enough speed that he puts spin on the ball through his speed, so the ball kicks up a little bit more in the air. But everything is a fade with this guy.
I'm sure he's playing a higher launching shaft.
Oh, I wouldn't be surprised if the way his club setup is built is to help, obviously, how low he wants to launch it with his shaft lean and everything. But significant amount. I mean, dude, look at the difference in the height of his shoulders at this point. Like, to have that high of a left shoulder and that low of a right shoulder. And then there's your shaft lean by the time he gets to the bottom. And combination of cupped lead wrist, combination of shaft lean, the combination of side bend. You add, side bend does what to the club face? Does it open it or close it on the way down? Opens it. Lead wrist cups, does that open or close the club face? Opens it. Shaft lean, let's not talk loft. Let's talk, how does it launch? Does it open or close it? Opens it. So you have a variable that opens the club face, a variable that opens the club face, a variable that opens the club face. He literally has no choice because his grip is so far in one direction wanting to close the club face, he needs all the tools in the world to prevent it from hooking. That's how you make it work. So you have one variable that's like 15 on 10 in terms of club face that wants to hook and shut, and then you have opens it a little bit, opens it a little bit, opens it a little bit, and you make it work. And the side bend also works with his lack of hand depth. So this is a combination that's like It's 8-1 in terms of delivering a functional ball flight, but I wouldn't teach this for the everyday golfer. It's too unique for an everyday golfer to manage. He has a skill set that is far beyond your average golfer, obviously. I mean, the reality is most golfers with the grip strength of his, unless they're wiping across the ball with like a really poor sequence or something, they're going to hook the crap out of it. Yeah. Okay, so Maurizio, for the video watchers, Maurizio's asking, how do you basically take a player like this and tweak it enough, but without, let's say, like altering too much of their DNA? Like,
well, yes and no. I mean, you want to play with the DNA, right?
You want to play with the DNA a little bit?
For them,
yeah.
And because they're doing so many things to compensate for something,
yeah.
Isn't that just making room for error and inconsistency?
Yes. So here's the thing. In terms of like the compensations that a player has, the first thing I like to do when I'm approaching players, and this is not exclusive to a tour player, just in general, are the compensations long-term something that are relatively easy for the player to manage? There are some compensations a player does that they can get away with. There are some compensations a player does that you're like, this is really crazy. And like, I don't know that a player has the ability to recreate that consistently enough. Second thing is, every scenario you're going to deal with, even with a tour player, is very subjective. If a guy like Ryan Fox comes and sees me and he missed 14 of his last 15 cuts and can't find a fairway to save his life, I'm sorry, I don't really care what this looks like, but something has got to give. Something's got to change. Because what you're doing no longer works. You have to remember, okay, and this is something I try to stress for every coach. When a player comes and sees you, never be afraid to make changes, okay? And I'll tell you why. First of all, I do a lot of mentorship stuff online too, right? And like obviously with you guys now. The first thing I always hear whenever I'm talking with coaches who haven't worked with tour players yet is like, I'm afraid to mess them up. What if I mess them up, right? Like you're dealing with a guy who's competing for a living. If he comes and sees you, there's going to be some innate fear of like, what if I put this guy into the garbage and he can no longer swing a club and lose his career? And you're afraid that it's your fault. You can't think that way, and I'll tell you why. Number one, every golfer of that level who comes to see you, they're not coming to see you because they're hitting it good. They're coming to see you because they're struggling. People don't seek out new coaches outside of like maybe a few outliers, like a Hovland or something like that. Your general tour player or very skilled golfer does not go and seek out new counsel when they're in a good state of their game. They're coming to see you because they're struggling, meaning they're already expecting a change of some format. It's your place to decide how significant you want to make the change. Second thing is, when you're dealing with guys like Ryan Fox, when you have patterns that are this extreme, oftentimes you just have to kind of manage them. Meaning, I'm going to keep an eye on his grip strength. I'm never going to take a guy like Ryan Fox, for example, and make his grip neutral. His whole swing is built around how strong his grip is. You cannot make him neutral. It's too extreme of a change. So when you're dealing with players with such unique patterns like this, you're managing and reducing the compensations, but you're not taking them away. He's always going to have this much side bend through the ball. He's always going to have this much separation through the ball. He's always going to have that strong of a grip. But if I can very subtly maybe add a hair of hand depth, maybe very subtly remove a little bit of how much he side bends through the ball, you might completely overhaul his game, even if it's 5% here, 5% there. So in a case of his where it's extreme, you're just trying to reduce how far in each direction those variables are extreme. I'm not taking them away. I'm never taking that away with a player like this because it's too unique. When you have a player who is coming into the studio, for example, and he's a 15 handicap and he's hitting it like absolute ass, but his swing looks like this, I'm overhauling the whole fucking swing. Because he's hitting it like shit. He's not very good to begin with. He doesn't have his skill set. He's not playing for a living. And these patterns are too extreme for a recreational golfer, for the most part, to manage. But you got a guy like this who's going to play a tournament tomorrow. If I took his swing and I told him, turn into your hip deeper and get your hands back here, next thing you know, he's side bending. His arms are stuck way inside out, and he might start the ball 4 fairways over to the right and not be able to bring it back. And now all of a sudden you have an extreme player that you're doing something that in your head makes sense philosophy-wise, but it doesn't work because of how unique his combination is. You can't go that far. So when you're taking a player like this, even if I did want to push him closer to, let's say, like the norm, it would be such a slow and incremental process that it's like in 6 months, if I can get him a tiny, tiny bit of hand depth and a tiny, tiny bit of a more leveled out shoulder turn, it might overhaul his whole game and help him. But you're retaining the structure of that. So the better the player is, the more you kind of have to go very slow and incremental and just reduce little compensations, but you're still retaining the compensations for the most part. That's the thing. Shitty golfer comes into the studio, sorry bro, I'm fucking overhauling your whole pattern because you're hitting it everywhere.
Has he been working with the same coach for
As far as my knowledge goes, he's been working with the same coach for a long time. I mean, I've seen him on the driving range at like 2-3 DP events, and he's always had the same guy around him over a couple year spread. So I'm just assuming I don't really know enough of his history, but as far as my knowledge goes, he's been working with the same coach for a long time. Okay, let's look at players who do not have the skill set of a Ryan Fox. Okay, swing maybe started just a little bit before the setup. What can you tell me about this player's alignments so far? A little bit more of a stereotypical takeaway position compared to, let's say, what we saw with Ryan Fox. So is the club face very strong here? Is it open here? Maybe a subtle amount of it being open. The toe is certainly not hanging back. It's not wide open. The hands in club working relatively around the body, which is pretty good. Maybe a tiny bit of some forearm rotation you can see. As soon as you see that right arm start to bend really early, a little bit of some cupping to the wrist. Yeah, a little bit of some cupping to the wrist as well. So you see face angle variables. You see wrist angle variables. Subtle change in knee flex. Are his hips turning? They're turning a little bit, right? Shoulder plane, is he coming up and out of the shot or anything like that? So it's a relatively standard takeaway, you would say, by all accounts. It's nothing stands out as extreme. It's not a scenario like what we just saw with Ryan Fox where there's a very unique blend. For the most part, this is probably more within the norm, right? Let's go straight to the top of the backswing. Tell me what you see here and what do you think is likely to happen. This is probably not what you would have expected given the takeaway, because the takeaway looked pretty decent. But what did we say about some forearm rotation? We saw a little bit of him wanting to open the forearms up in the takeaway, right? Well, if I retain that forearm rotation to the top, where's the club going to point? More here or more there? More let off, right? If I twist the forearms into an open position, if we're going to assume that there's no reaction later in the backswing, if I create, even if this looks good, if I'm starting to rotate my forearms this way, and then I just retain my forearms in this position as I go up, the club's going to point laid off every time. Obviously, what we'll see more commonly is if a golfer rotates their forearms too much too early, there's probably going to be some form of a reaction later that will tip it across the line. But did his forearms rotate really, really early aggressively? Not really, right? We kind of saw the takeaway look pretty neutral. What we don't see in a still image is it's going this way. So it keeps going that way to the top of the backswing. All of a sudden, you get to the top. What are two big problems with this here? Club face, a lot of toe hang. So club face is pretty open in this scenario, right? Okay, so club face is wide open, and then the shaft. Do we like for the length of his backswing where the shaft is pointing? Not really. What is the likely outcome of a golfer whose face is open and club is laid off here? It's not a guarantee it'll happen. He might reroute this really well. That's the fun of golf, is you don't know how he's going to react from here. But what are the likely outcomes? Your goal as a coach is not to assume, it's just to understand patterns. What is the likeliest outcome from being laid off and open from here? So as the hands start to lower, I'm going to apply some force on the grip. It's normal, right? When I'm really across the line and my hand's lower, you'll see more often than not a rerouting late into a shallow position. When they're very upright and laid off, and then my hands start to lower, what's going to happen to the pitch of the shaft? It's going to start to get steeper and cut in front of me. Do you think his are going to get steeper and come in front of him, or do you think I'm tricking you? Unfortunately, this is not a trick question. His club definitely tries to kick out in front of him. Why does it not kick out in front of him? Because it's trying to get steeper, but it doesn't actually get steeper. Well, it steepens a little bit, and then he saves it into a good spot. You wouldn't expect the club to get here, given where he was at the top. So what is something he's done to prevent this club from being, let's say, out here? Because in reality, it wants to get out there. A lot of side bend. You can see some extension. You can see the shoulders going this way, already getting a little jammed up. So there is essentially, the simplest way I can explain it, there are compensations being made within the structure of his body tilts and his pivot to prevent this club from ending out here. If he was somebody who, with where he was at the top, kept the left side nice and low and rotated really well, what would happen to the club, you think? It would look like this on the way down. So this is a scenario where, and Maurizio, I'll relate this back to your question from the last one, there is a compensation being done from his body. The compensation is not the root cause of the problem. He's not going to stall out because he wants to stall out. He's stalling because the club was in a bad spot. It wanted to get steeper. And then to prevent it from actually getting steeper, his body's like, no thanks. Basically, he's laid off like this. It wants to work a little steeper. And then his body's like, no, I think I can actually keep it in a decent position. But where's my chest going now? I have no chance. So do you think he's somebody who's going to rotate really well through the ball? Probably not, right? So let's advance this now a little bit. Is this somebody who rotated really well through the ball? Look at his arm structure through the ball. So he had to square the face up because the face was open. You'll see a chicken wing and you'll see a very high exit usually when you're not really doing many good things with your pivot, right? If my body rotates, as my body rotates more, what direction are my hands going to exit through the ball? Left. As my hands exit left, you'll see the club exit left. If my body needed to compensate for a laid off position that was steepening, I'm going to do something with my spine to make it work. And then I get jammed up here like he did. And then I held on for dear life not to hit a hook, which is what he did. And then what do you see with the exit pattern? More upright, more chicken wing, yada, yada, yada. So let's work our way backwards here. What is the solution for a player like this? What is the starting point of the solution to get this player a chance to not have to do that with his body through the ball? So first step is to try to limit the amount of forearm rotation in the backswing, because we know, and we saw it earlier, that the forearm rotation continues and it points the shaft really laid off and behind him. We can probably afford to get control of this club face. How can I realign this club at the top without even needing to tell him anything about the forearm rotation? Look at his hips. He is somebody who, does he change knee flex as well? Not bad. It's not terrible. You see a nice big gap between his knees. Is a gap between the knees a guarantee that a golfer is rotating their hips?
Yeah, exactly.
Can I theoretically cheat it? It looks like I'm doing a weird dance, but can I theoretically cheat it?
We see that all the time.
Right? I can create a gap between my knees here with very little hip turn. Or I can do it properly and get the hip a lot deeper. So, in theory, there's a gap between his knees because the knees are changing flex. His right leg is a lot more extended than his left one, but he's cheating the turn. He's not actually turning his pelvis much. So if he turned his pelvis, the chest turns, you turn the chest, where does the club go? Right now he's like this, and if I just took this guy and said, hey, we can just like create more turn, the club would realign somewhat in that direction too. So there are ways to clean it up for him. If I just got him to rotate more in his backswing, I would theoretically get the hands a hair deeper. I would theoretically realign the shaft at the top, which would prevent it from steepening. That would not do a whole lot to his club face. You're correct. That would either need to be done by still reducing some of the forearm rotation, or changing the way his wrist works at the top, or just strengthening the shit out of his grip. Choice is yours at the end of the day, depending on the rest of the pattern, what's easier. You have a lot of different ways you can go about it. That's the fun of golf. I don't necessarily have to get the grip stronger to change the club face. I can do it by getting rid of one of the variables that's opening his club face up in his backswing. But I can also just keep that variable, get him to turn more to get it down the line, and instead of my grip being here, my grip now is stronger, which makes it look like this at the top.
So, this is the talking point.
Yeah.
Let's set this guy as an example, just relative to his club face.
Mm-hmm.
Would it theoretically be simpler to strengthen the shit out of his grip so that he can just move the way that he naturally moves?
So here's the thing. I like strengthening the grip when I need to close the club face, if it actually is the simplest option. The thing is, sometimes it's a trick and it's not actually the simplest option, because everything comes with a price. If I strengthen his grip, in theory, you're assuming his club face would be more closed. What you're not considering, and what most people don't consider, is the fact that when you strengthen the grip, the wrist mechanics will change. If the wrist mechanics now change, because my wrist is going to look very different at setup, meaning it's going to look very different through the rest of the swing, I am now also affecting other variables within his pattern. Of course, if I strengthen the grip and no other variable changes, it's a guarantee that everything remains constant, then it's an easy answer to just say strengthen your grip and you're fine. If his grip was already very strong, which it might actually be on the stronger side for the record, because he's got a significant amount of extension on the wrist, but he also has a lot of forearm rotation. For all we know, the grip might be neutral to strong-ish already. Do you want to put him in an extreme position? That's another question you have to ask yourself. So I'm okay with strengthening the grip to close the club face under the assumption that everything else can remain fairly constant and it's an easy route. If I'm going to strengthen the grip and the wrist angle is going to change, and if the wrist angle changes, it now penalizes the shaft movement a little bit, you're playing a dicey game, because now you have to also then change something else anyways. You're back to square one of needing to make two variable changes, not one. You only change grip when you can guarantee that it's the only change you're making, if that makes sense. Right? Does all this make sense? So in theory, you get him, and by the way, he actually reacts for the club face a lot better than you would expect in transition. Just as a reference point, his lead wrist is not nearly as cupped here as it was at the top of the backswing, meaning it's moved a little bit towards a flat position. If it moves a little bit towards a flat position, the club face is no longer as fanned open. His club face is not necessarily that strong here, but it's certainly not as open as it looked at the top. Right? We are seeing a little bit of some twisting of this coming down, because the lead wrist went from very cupped to just a little bit flatter, which got the club face a little bit better. In fairness, I do think strengthening his grip would help him, personally. But at the same time, it's not the only way you can approach it. There's a lot of different ways you can get him there. Does all this make sense so far? We're going to go to round 2 now.